I would never have noticed Hajj Muhammad al-Khidra'a had not one of my companions pointed him out to me in a large gathering of Sufis in Meknes in 1975. He did not have an imposing appearance. He was an elderly man in his 70s or 80s, white-bearded with a high forehead and wearing the dark green turban of the Darqawa, lost in the crowd, head bowed, reciting qasaid. We somehow expect men of spiritual attainment to have an obvious beatific presence. This is sometimes the case, but more often than not, the saints are wrapped in anonymity. He had been the mu'adhin, the one who delivers the call to prayer, of Sefru, a small village outside Fez. He was, I was told, a very great saint. For many years he had lived in a state of extreme dread, or khawf, of God. This is an exalted and very terrible spiritual condition on the way in which the Sufi is overwhelmed with fear and paralyzed by a direct experience of God's majesty, or Jalal. According to Muli Abdul Qadir al-Jilani in Futuh al-Ghaib, al-Jalal produces a disquieting fear and creates disturbing apprehension and overpowers the heart in such an awful manner, and its symptoms become visible on the physical body. According to fuqara who knew him at the time, Hajj Muhammad lived for years in a state of paralysis and terror, rarely speaking and weeping copiously. He constantly trembled with fear and was repeatedly struck by what the Sufis call barq, or lightning, which is a spiritual event where a powerful electric-like wave shoots from the base of the spine through the neck like a lightning bolt. When this happens, the fakir should cry out the name of Allah and then lower the eyes and say a blessing on the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. The experience can be shattering and hits certain people on the path from time to time. In Hajj Muhammad's case, lightning struck him over and over and over again for years. The impact is hard to imagine. But by the time I met him, he had passed through this station, transformed, and was now basking in the beauty, Jamal, and mercy of God. His whole manner was effusive, light, and overflowing. He was childlike, innocent, and unreservedly sweet. Mullah Abdul Qadir al-Jilani described this condition in Futuh al-Ghaib as the divine reflection on the heart of man, producing light, joy, elegance, and sweet words, and loving conversation, and glad tidings with regard to great gifts and high position and closeness to himself. A few days later, Hajj Muhammad came to us and spoke. He could barely contain himself. He was like a shimmering river. It was as if he were reporting excitedly from the vantage point of paradise. His entire talk consisted of ways to get to heaven, what happens there, and the overwhelming mercy of God. Everything seemed to well up within him. It all seemed so accessible, so close. He was utterly convincing, simple, and sane. I had been similarly impressed by the quiet assurances of the illuminated saint Mullah Abul Qasim, but whereas Mullah Abul Qasim spoke infrequently and with deep, ecstatic gravitas, Hajj Muhammad inundated us with glad tidings. He spoke for hours. I remember he admonished us all to complete our supplications or dua to Allah with the invocation, Ya Dhal Jalali wal Ikram. This, he said, was a seal that would ensure our prayers would be answered. He also told us, when things are going well, have fear of Allah, and when things are going badly, have hope in Allah.
Allah.
When he finished, we all left together to attend a Laylat al-Fuqara, literally a night of the poor, which is a night of dhikr. We walked as a group from the courtyard house we were renting in the old city to the home of one of the wealthy fuqara who had invited us for the evening. Hajj Muhammad's talk had left me completely exhilarated, and as we walked, I fell into step with him. In his discourse, he had said that with every step one took with the tahleel, with la ilaha illallah, on one's tongue, one built a castle in paradise. As we walked silently side by side, both of us invoking the tahleel, I was filled with the sensation that this was actually happening. Before we parted company that evening, Hajj Muhammad invited us to come to Tanger. After this sublime group, I led a group of fuqara to the Middle Atlas. On the way back, I fell asleep. During a bus ride, on awakening in Khanifra, I found that my wallet with all my money and passport had been stolen. I was originally supposed to travel to Algeria, but found myself stuck in Morocco without a passport and penniless. I borrowed a little money and made my way on a wooden train from Nesta to Tanger, where the U.S. Consulate General was, to try and get a replacement passport and wire England for enough money to get back to London. This was not the first time in my life I was completely alone, reduced to poverty, and almost absolutely helpless, but it was the first time this had happened to me in a foreign country. I had the equivalent of about $5 after my train fare, passport expenses, and the cost of a telegram. I made my way to the Siddiqui Zawiya in the ancient part of Tanger, and in the time-honored tradition of the Sufis, requested lodging. After explaining my circumstances, the caretaker of the Zawiya showed me to a windowless cupboard behind the Qibla wall of the mosque with a small bed. I gratefully accepted. The first day I was at the Zawiya, I joined the weekly Laylatul Fuqara. I sat in the back of the gathering in a state of extreme helplessness. As qasaid from a diwan were sung by the large assembly, I began to remember Hajj Muhammad for no particular reason. His beautiful old face loomed up in my mind's eye and filled my heart. An overwhelming desire to see him welled up within me. I knew he lived in Tanger, but had no idea how to find him. I longed to see him, and I began to weep, his face etched in my memory, the sound of remembrance surrounding me. I put my face in my hands and wept for a very, very long time. At the conclusion of the first phase of the invocation, the gathering began to recite the La ilaha illallah over and over again in a wonderful lilting melody I'd never heard before. My weeping subsided. I looked up, and across the circle, I saw Hajj Muhammad. It seemed as if he didn't notice me, but when the assembly stood to perform the Hadra, Hajj Muhammad purposefully moved around the circle beside me and took my hand. We performed the Hadra hand in hand. At the end of the dance, he turned to me, kissed my hand in greeting, and departed. In a state of high excitement, I rushed to the caretaker of the Zawiya and pointed out Hajj Muhammad's departing figure. I asked him if he knew him. He said, "No, I've never seen him before. He never comes here." After accepting lodging at the Siddiqui Zawiya, I privately vowed to myself not to ask anyone for anything more. I used most of the money I had left to purchase oranges and svinges, which are Moroccan-style donuts, and they're really oily. I subsisted on this fare for 3 days. On the third day, I began to become weak and ill. The greasy svinges and the acidity of the oranges gave me severe stomach pains. After the noon prayer on the third day, I raised my hands in supplication and asked Allah. I said, "Allah, I'm getting sick, and this will put my host to more trouble. Please, please feed me so I can keep up my strength." The moment I finished my supplication, a young man about my age, sitting beside me, turned and struck up a conversation with me. It was the usual sort of encounter one had in mosques. I was accustomed to conversations with young Muslims from the Arab world, fascinated with the West and Westerners, and amazed that an American or European would want to become a Muslim and come to their countries, when most of them dreamed of the exotic, wealthy West. It was a typical exchange, mostly about me being from America. I mentioned that I was staying in the Zawiya, but that was all. Almost as an afterthought, he asked me if I'd had lunch. Keeping in mind my vow, I lied and told him that I'd already eaten, but he suddenly insisted that I come upstairs with him to eat. I couldn't believe it. It was the answer to my prayers. From that moment on, without ever asking, I was fed morning, noon, and night for 3 weeks, and by the end of this period, I was not so much being fed as feasted as a guest of eminent Moroccan scholars and wealthy business people and so on. I never had to ask for anything. The young man who first invited me was named Mustafa. He was from Tetuan and had spent years working in factories in Spain because he couldn't find work as an imam, which was what he'd been trained for. He had been the imam of a mosque in Tetuan and was hafiz of Quran. He recited Quran with a stunning, angelic voice. He lived upstairs in the Siddiqui Zawiya with his uncle, who had a position in the Siddiqui Sufi order, and a number of other young hufaz in similar circumstances. Mustafa took me under his wing, mainly I think because he was fascinated by America and because we both spoke broken Spanish and could communicate. I didn't know a word of Arabic at the time. 2 days later, I was walking in the Nouveau Ville, or the new town, with Mustafa. He told me about his frustrations and desire to get married, how girls were not interested in men who knew Quran, but wanted to marry men who were worldly and had money, and so on. As we climbed up the steep hill from the old town to the Nouveau Ville, I found myself thinking about Hajj Muhammad. I thought to myself, I hope we meet him. I hope he invites me to lunch. The moment this thought, I'm not exaggerating, the moment this thought came to mind, we turned a corner, and standing before us was Hajj Muhammad. He beamed, kissed our hands, and said, "Salamskum, would you like to come to lunch with me?" I was overjoyed. Hajj Muhammad asked us to come the next day and showed us where his house was in the new town. He took us on a tour of his home, which was an apartment in a modern block of flats. He was particularly pleased with his European-style bathroom, the Hammam Farangi, which he showed us with almost childlike pride. We then promised to return the following day and took our leave. Now, I asked Mustafa to join me for lunch the next day. I needed him to translate for me. He was not enthusiastic. He said he was not sure if he could. I pleaded with him, and in my excitement and to convince him to come with me, I said, "He's a great saint. He's a great wali Allah." At this, Mustafa stopped suddenly and scolded me. He said, "You mustn't say that. If he's a wali, I'm a wali. You're a wali. A wali Allah is someone very rare and special. He's a sweet old man, but you mustn't call him a wali Allah. This is something very serious." I replied defensively, "I didn't make this up. I've been told by people of authority that he's one of the awliya." Mustafa wasn't convinced. "I don't think so," he said. I said, "Okay, but please come with me tomorrow." He said, "I'll see. I'm not sure." The next day, I managed to drag Mustafa out of the Zawiya up the hill to the Nouveau Ville for our luncheon engagement. We came to the flat at the appointed time. Hajj Muhammad's wife answered the door and said that he'd gone out and would be back soon. She asked us to come back in half an hour. We retired to a nearby park overlooking Tanger harbor to wait. I could see Mustafa was becoming impatient and began to worry that he'd abandon me. In the park, he ran into a friend of his. I waited for half an hour, looking out over Tanger and the harbor. Mustafa was engaged in conversation with his friend and showed no interest in returning to Hajj Muhammad's. I waited as long as I could and then said to Mustafa that I was going on ahead back to Hajj Muhammad's house. "Please join me when you're done here," I pleaded. Mustafa said that he might, but I wasn't optimistic. I made my way back to the block of flats and ascended the stairs to Hajj Muhammad's flat. He opened the door when I knocked, beaming, greeting me with "Salamskum." I greeted him back and gave him a pot of honey I had purchased with the little money I had left. He was thrilled and thanked me profusely. His happiness made my heart sing. I felt that I'd done the right thing. He led me to a sitting room off the entrance and sat me on a couch beside him. There were 2 cups of sweet, milky coffee on the coffee table in front of him. I assumed one was for him and one was for me. He moved both in front of me and smiled. We smiled at each other, but couldn't communicate. He shrugged. I shrugged and sipped my coffee. I was incredibly frustrated, but could do nothing. Hajj Muhammad excused himself and went into another room. He sat down when he returned, and we looked at each other helplessly. I could tell he wanted to say things to me, but it was no use. I prayed that Mustafa would turn up. Finally, after about 20 minutes, the doorbell rang. Mustafa had arrived after all. Hajj Muhammad greeted him with his buoyant salam skum and kissed his hand and led him to the couch, sitting between the 2 of us. He then turned to Mustafa with a twinkling eye and said something to him in Arabic, which made Mustafa's jaw drop. Mustafa looked over at me, stunned. I asked eagerly, "What did he just say?" Mustafa said in Shach, he said, "I just wanted to let you know that I really am a wali Allah." I almost burst out laughing. The 3 of us had an incredible lunch. Hajj Muhammad was irrepressible. He told us that when he was in Mecca at the Kaaba, an angel appeared to him and told him that the blast of Israfil would take place in 22 years. According to Sufi scholars, the trumpet blast of Israfil signifies the destruction of the world and the end of time. He added, "So be careful of your religion." This was in 1975, which would have meant, if we were to take Hajj Muhammad literally, that the world would be ended now. It would have ended in 1997. Of course, we're still here. And this illustrates something else that is often misunderstood about the awliya. Many outsiders and the uninitiated assume that sainthood is equated with infallibility. According to Sheikh Saleh al-Jafari, the difference between a prophet and a saint is that prophets are not allowed to make mistakes. They are, he said, disciplined by God. But awliya Allah can and do make mistakes. God disciplines the prophets and messengers. God's saints are illuminated and possessed of deep spiritual knowledge, but they're not infallible. Sheikh Abdul Qadir Isa reinforces this point, saying that the disciple should not believe his sheikh to be infallible. Even if the sheikh is in the best of spiritual conditions, he is still not infallible. The most important part of Hajj Muhammad's message was the admonition, be careful of your deen. He was also adamant that when we sat in circles of dhikr, we should not interlock our fingers in our laps, but put one palm in another. He said that shaitan sits with interlocking fingers like this. And I was with an incredible mujdub a couple years ago, and someone was, one of our companions was sitting like that, and he said, "Don't do that," you know. That's what the way shaitan sits. Everything Hajj Muhammad said was linked to practical instruction, basically on how to get to heaven. It was hard to believe that this old man had been shaking with fear less than 2 years before. He was effusive, joyful, serene, and overflowing with good news. Okay, now I'm going to skip a little bit because it just goes on. During my long layover, I was becoming a part of the small community of Sufis in Tanger. I was invited to the homes of scholars and other Sufis. I would perform the Siddiqui weird in darkness after the dawn prayer with 2 or 3 devoted fuqara. I would eat lunch daily with a very aged imam who ate in incredibly slow motion. I mean, he was like, literally like that, you know, and I had to sort of keep his pace. To be courteous, I tried to keep his pace, but found it almost impossible. I had submitted my application for a new passport to the U.S. consulate, but they needed to send it to the embassy in Rabat for approval. Weeks passed. I would check every few days. Finally, the consul informed me that the passport would be ready. I was to pick it up at 7 a.m. in the morning. I had wired to my work in London for an advance on my salary and had already received funds to get me back to London. I booked passage on a boat to Algeciras, which was to leave at 8:30 a.m. in the morning. I walked up the hill from the Siddiqui Zawiya to the U.S. consulate to receive my new passport. All the way up the hill and all the way down, I kept debating whether I should pay a quick visit to say farewell to Hajj Muhammad. I could have made a side trip on the way back to the old city, but it was about 7:30 a.m., and I wasn't sure whether Hajj Muhammad stayed awake after the dawn prayers or, as many people did, returned to sleep. In any case, it felt awkward to simply knock on the door to say goodbye, a little like my not very well received obligatory gift of sugar. I gave him another gift later on, which this is part of the section I cut out, and he said, "Don't ever do that again," because it was just like routine. I was trying to repeat my... With a pang of regret, I carried on down the hill, bag and passport in hand, into the Sacco Chico, the central square in the old town. The square was completely deserted, not a soul to be seen. All the shops were still closed. A cafe on the square with an outdoor terrace was just opening. I walked into the bar and ordered a coffee. When I turned around to walk back out to sit on the terrace, perfectly framed by the door, standing alone across the square, was Hajj Muhammad. It was like a scene in a movie. It took my breath away. I put my bag down by the table and walked straight toward him. We were alone in the Sacco Chico. As I approached him, he seemed to be preoccupied with something in a small shoulder purse. I greeted him. He looked up and seemed surprised to see me, as if this was pure coincidence. I told him I was leaving. He prayed for me and said to come back to see him sometime. I knew we would never meet again. He then turned and made his way back up the hill toward the Nouveau Ville. I turned back to the cafe and my coffee, and then made my way toward the dock to take the boat to Algeciras. It was the last time I ever saw this great soul. I will never forget him. May Allah be well pleased with him. And I end this chapter with a quotation from Abul Abbas al-Mursi. He says, and this is very important, "It is more difficult to recognize the friend of God than it is to recognize God himself. After all, God is recognized by virtue of his perfection and beauty. By contrast, how long will it take you to come to know another creature like yourself who eats as you eat and drinks as you drink?"